Right, as President Trump walks back tariffs on most products from Mexico and Canada again, Canada says retaliatory tariffs will stay in place until that pause is permanent.
The United States just got hit with a trade shock, but not from China. While Washington was locked in its usual economic battles, Canada made a bold power move in Europe. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with NATO and European Union leaders, not to talk military, but to push a new economic agenda. Buy Canadian. This isn't just diplomacy. It's a direct challenge to U.S. suppliers in European markets. If Canada convinces NATO allies to restructure supply chains, it could shift billions of dollars away from the United States, weakening its economic leverage. So, is Canada quietly positioning itself as an alternative trade powerhouse? Or is this just a short-term strategy to pressure Washington? The consequences could reshape global trade as we know it. Let's break down Canada's NATO trade ambush. While Washington was preoccupied with its ongoing trade battles, Canada made an unexpected and strategic move at a recent NATO summit. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's mission was not about military alliances or defense commitments. It was about business. Canada's goal? To position itself as a viable alternative to the United States in the European market. At the heart of Trudeau's pitch was a simple yet powerful message: buy Canadian. But this was more than a slogan. It was a direct challenge to U.S. suppliers who have long dominated NATO economies. Trudeau met with European Union leaders and NATO allies, not to discuss security issues, but to secure economic deals that could fundamentally reshape transatlantic trade. Canada's approach is strategic and calculated, targeting key sectors where it can compete aggressively against American exports. Manufacturing is a major focus, with Canada positioning itself as a high-quality, cost-effective alternative to U.S. industrial goods. With its advanced manufacturing sector and lower production costs in some areas, Canada is appealing to European companies looking to diversify their supply chains. Another major weapon in Canada's trade arsenal is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, a deal between Canada and the European Union. Unlike U.S. trade agreements, which have faced political instability and renegotiations, CETA provides predictable and tariff-free access to European markets. This agreement gives Canada a competitive edge over the U.S. in securing long-term trade relationships with European businesses. If NATO allies begin even a slight shift in their supply chains away from the U.S. and toward Canada, the financial impact could be staggering. Billions of dollars in lost trade deals would weaken U.S. economic influence over Europe. The most critical sectors at risk include aerospace and defense contracts, traditionally dominated by U.S. firms, energy exports where Canada could gain market share from U.S. suppliers, and technology and industrial goods if European companies start preferring Canadian alternatives. The ripple effect would be profound. A gradual but steady shift toward Canadian suppliers could force U.S. companies to cut jobs, lower prices, or even relocate operations to remain competitive. But why would Europe even consider abandoning the U.S.? The answer is more strategic than you think. Why Europe might be ready to ditch U.S. imports. Europe has long relied on the United States for economic stability, but recent frustrations with U.S. trade policies have changed the game. From tariffs to supply chain disruptions, European leaders are realizing that their economic dependence on the U.S. comes with significant risks. Canada's latest move comes at a time when many European countries are actively looking for ways to diversify their trade partnerships, and Canada is offering them a compelling alternative. One of the biggest concerns for European economies is supply chain diversification. Over the past decade, Europe has seen how over-reliance on a single supplier, whether it be China for electronics or the U.S. for industrial goods, can leave them vulnerable to economic shocks. The unpredictability of U.S. trade policy, with frequent changes in tariffs and trade agreements, has created an urgent need for European businesses to explore other options. Canada, with its stable trade policies and strong manufacturing sector, is positioning itself as an attractive alternative. Energy security is another critical factor. Europe's reliance on foreign energy sources has been a major geopolitical issue, particularly in the wake of conflicts affecting oil and gas supply from Russia. The U.S. has historically been a major energy supplier, But Canada is offering a more stable and geopolitically neutral alternative. With its vast reserves of natural gas and oil, Canada is making a strong case for European countries to look north instead of west when it comes to securing their energy future. Trade freedom is also a driving force behind Europe's interest in Canada. U.S. trade deals often come with complex regulations, political strings, and sudden policy shifts that create uncertainty for businesses. In contrast, Canada's agreements, particularly CETA with the European Union, offer European businesses a predictable, tariff-free environment. This lack of trade restrictions makes Canada a far more attractive partner for long-term economic planning. The question is, if this shift happens, what does it actually mean in economic terms? If this shift happens, what does it actually mean in dollars? Let's look at the numbers. The billion-dollar impact. Trade between Canada and the European Union already stands at $119 billion annually, and that number is growing. However, what happens if European nations decide to move just 5 to 10% of their imports away from the US and toward Canada? The economic consequences could be massive, not just for American businesses, but for Washington's global economic standing. Even a modest 5% shift in transatlantic trade could result in billions of dollars in lost U.S. export revenue. Canada, on the other hand, would gain significant economic leverage in future trade deals, making it less dependent on Washington's policies and more influential in global markets. The industries most at risk include aerospace, energy, and technology, where American firms have traditionally held a dominant position in European markets. If European businesses begin favoring Canadian contracts over American ones, U.S. suppliers could lose long-term deals, forcing them to lower prices or risk losing their foothold in critical industries. This would lead to job cuts, declining exports, and a weakened economic position for the U.S. in global trade negotiations. For Washington, this situation presents a serious economic dilemma. The U.S. has always counted on its trade dominance within NATO as a tool for maintaining global influence. If that dominance starts to erode, it could trigger further economic shifts away from U.S. suppliers, accelerating a decline in Washington's ability to dictate trade terms. If the U.S. economy takes a hit, how will Washington respond? That's where things get complicated. Washington's dilemma. Now that Canada has made its move, the U.S. faces a critical decision. Should Washington push back aggressively to protect its economic influence? Or should it accept Canada's rising role in global trade? Each choice comes with major risks. One option is to fight back by offering European businesses better incentives to stick with U.S. suppliers. This could mean lowering tariffs, improving trade deals, or offering subsidies to make American exports more attractive. However, this strategy carries a significant risk. If the U.S. pushes too hard, it could be seen as economic coercion, driving European businesses even closer to Canada. The other option is to ignore Canada's trade shift and hope it does not become a long-term trend. This is a dangerous gamble. If the U.S. does nothing, Canada could solidify its new trade relationships, making it even harder for American companies to reclaim their lost market share. This is not just about trade. It is about economic power and influence. Canada's rise as an alternative trade partner threatens Washington's decades-long economic dominance in NATO. If the U.S. fails to respond effectively, it may find itself losing not just trade deals, but global influence. But this is just the beginning. Canada's trade strategy is not limited to Europe. It is part of a much bigger global play. The NATO economic power shift. The United States has maintained a strong grip on NATO's economic foundation for years. The transatlantic alliance has long relied on the United States not just for military defense, but also for economic leadership. Washington has shaped trade policies, secured export deals, and ensured its position as the primary supplier for NATO countries. Economic dominance has been a crucial tool, allowing the United States to dictate trade agreements, influence foreign policy, and protect its industries from global competition. But now, Canada is challenging this dominance in a way that few expected. At a recent NATO and European Union summit, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did not focus on military strategy. Instead, he made a direct pitch for NATO allies to reconsider their economic dependence on American suppliers. His message was clear. Canada offers a viable alternative for manufacturing, energy, and aerospace industries, urging European nations to shift their supply chains accordingly. If this strategy succeeds, it reduces Washington's ability to use trade as a political tool. The United States has often leveraged its economic influence over NATO allies to maintain strategic partnerships, ensuring that European nations remained closely tied to American trade networks. But if Canada provides similar goods with fewer trade restrictions and competitive pricing, European nations may see little reason to stay locked into American supply chains. The long-term consequence is even more significant. If NATO countries become accustomed to trading without relying on the United States, Washington's global influence could begin to erode. The ability to control NATO's economic backbone has long been a strategic advantage for the United States. But if Canada disrupts that structure, the global balance of power may start to shift. And Canada isn't stopping with Europe. Its trade ambitions go much further. Canada's global trade play. Canada's bold strategy in NATO is not an isolated move. It is part of a much larger global trade realignment. Beyond Europe, Canada has been aggressively expanding its trade relationships with Latin America, Asia, and even the Middle East. This expansion is designed to ensure that Canada is less reliant on the United States for economic stability, giving it the ability to negotiate stronger trade agreements on its own terms. This shift is critical because a more diverse trade network means less vulnerability to American economic policies. Historically, Canada has sent around 75% of its exports to the United States, making it highly dependent on its southern neighbor. However, by strengthening trade agreements with regions like Europe, Latin America, and Asia, Canada is ensuring that it does not remain economically trapped under Washington's influence. If Canada successfully builds a global trade empire, it weakens U.S. economic control over key markets. The United States has long used its economic strength to maintain influence over its allies, ensuring that nations remain tied to its supply chains. But if Canada creates strong, independent trade routes, it disrupts Washington's dominance and gives global economies an alternative to relying solely on the U.S. But can Canada actually replace the United States as a trade leader? Let's break it down. Is Canada capable of replacing the U.S. in global trade? While Canada's global trade strategy is ambitious, the real question is whether it can actually replace the United States as a dominant economic power. The answer is complex. Canada has several advantages that make it an attractive alternative to American suppliers. But it also faces serious limitations that prevent it from fully replacing the United States on the world stage. One of Canada's biggest strengths is its abundance of natural resources. The country is a major global supplier of energy, raw materials, and agricultural products, making it an essential player in global trade. With growing concerns about energy security, particularly in Europe, Canada's oil and natural gas reserves provide a stable and politically safe alternative to U.S. and Russian energy sources. This allows Canada to position itself as a key energy supplier for nations looking to reduce their dependence on volatile markets. Another key advantage is Canada's political stability. Unlike the United States, where trade policies can change dramatically with each new administration, Canada offers long-term economic consistency. This predictability makes it an appealing partner for international businesses that want stability in their supply chains. However, Canada still has significant limitations that prevent it from becoming a true replacement for the U.S. The most obvious challenge is Canada's smaller manufacturing base. While Canada has strong industries in aerospace, technology, and automotive production, its manufacturing capacity is far smaller than that of the United States. Many global businesses still rely on the U.S. for large-scale industrial production, a sector where Canada cannot yet compete at the same level. Another major limitation is Canada's technological sector. While Canada is growing in areas like artificial intelligence and clean energy, it lacks the dominance in semiconductor production, software development, and defense manufacturing that makes the United States a global economic powerhouse. Additionally, Canada's global trade routes still rely heavily on American infrastructure. Many Canadian exports pass through U.S. ports, railways, and logistics networks, meaning the United States still maintains some control over how Canadian goods move through the global market. Ultimately, while Canada is growing as a global trade player, it is not yet capable of fully replacing the United States. However, that does not mean Washington is taking this lightly. Far from it. With tensions rising, could this turn into a full-scale economic battle? The first shots. Tensions between the United States and Canada have always existed beneath the surface, but this time the stakes are higher than ever. What started as a simple trade shift could quickly escalate into a full-blown economic conflict, with both nations taking aggressive actions to protect their interests. If this happens, it will not be a slow, drawn-out process. Trade wars can ignite overnight with a single government decision. The first likely move would come from Washington. If the United States sees Canada's growing trade influence in Europe as a direct threat, it could respond by imposing tariffs on Canadian exports. The United States has used tariffs as a weapon before, targeting China, Mexico, and even the European Union. This time, Canada could be next. The United States could introduce high tariffs on key Canadian industries, such as lumber, energy, and agriculture, which would make Canadian goods more expensive for American consumers. This would hurt Canadian businesses while giving American industries an artificial competitive edge. But Canada would not stay silent. If Washington attacks first, Ottawa has a clear response, cutting key imports from the United States. Canada is one of the largest buyers of American steel, aluminum, and agricultural products. Retaliatory tariffs would cripple American manufacturers, forcing them to look elsewhere for raw materials while dealing with higher costs. More importantly, Canada could use its energy exports as leverage, limiting oil and gas shipments to the United States, a move that could spike energy prices for American consumers. The final and most unexpected escalation could come from NATO allies choosing sides. If European countries begin openly supporting Canada's trade ambitions, it would send a clear message to Washington that its traditional allies no longer view it as an economic leader. This would not just be a financial blow, it would be a major political defeat. NATO, long dominated by the United States, could start shifting its trade dependence away from Washington and toward Ottawa, creating a permanent shift in economic power. But if a trade war does erupt, who takes the biggest hit? The consequences might not be as one-sided as you think. The economic fallout. Who loses the most? A US-Canada trade war would not be a clean victory for either side. Instead, it would send shockwaves through global markets, disrupting supply chains, increasing costs, and creating economic uncertainty for businesses, consumers, and entire industries on both sides of the border. The biggest question is, who would suffer the most? At first, American businesses would feel the impact immediately. Many US industries rely heavily on Canadian imports, from raw materials like wood, aluminum, and oil, to finished products such as auto parts. Higher tariffs on Canadian goods would force American companies to either absorb the additional costs or pass them on to consumers. This would result in higher prices for everyday essentials, from cars and electronics to construction materials and groceries, hitting American households directly in their wallets. Small businesses that depend on affordable imports could be forced to downsize or shut down altogether. On the Canadian side, the economic consequences would also be severe. The US is Canada's largest trading partner, and a prolonged trade war could lead to widespread job losses in export-driven industries. However, Canada could retaliate with its own tariffs, targeting key American sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing. Additionally, Canada might seek to strengthen trade relations with other global powers, like the European Union and China, to offset losses from the US market. This shift could permanently alter North America's economic landscape. The most unpredictable factor in this scenario is the global market reaction. Investors and businesses fear uncertainty, and a trade war between two of the world's largest economies would send financial markets into turmoil. If NATO countries and other allies decide to distance themselves from the United States and increase trade with Canada, international investors could lose confidence in the US economy. This could weaken the dollar, slow economic growth, and make American exports less competitive. If the conflict drags on, companies might relocate supply chains, leading to a long-term shift in economic power. But even if Canada struggles in the short term, could this trade war lead to a permanent change in global trade dynamics? Would Washington maintain control, or would new alliances and economic partnerships reshape North America's future? Is this the start of a permanent trade shift? Trade wars do not just cause short-term disruptions. They can reshape global trade relationships for decades. The battle between Canada and the United States could mark the beginning of a much bigger shift, one where the U.S. loses its traditional dominance over Western trade. If European nations stick with Canada, Washington would be forced to rethink its trade policies. The United States has long relied on its position as the dominant economic power in NATO. But if NATO members start looking to Canada as a more stable trade partner, it would weaken U.S. influence across the alliance. This could force Washington to offer better trade deals to keep its allies from defecting, essentially making Canada's strategy a success. But what if Washington retaliates too aggressively? If the United States goes all in on economic pressure, it could accelerate its own decline. Pushing too hard might make NATO allies even more determined to find alternatives to U.S. imports. If Washington overplays its hand, it risks turning a temporary shift into a permanent realignment. The future of this trade war depends on how far each country is willing to go. If both sides pull back and find a compromise, the damage might be contained. But if Washington and Ottawa dig in for a prolonged conflict, it could fundamentally change the way Western nations trade, and Canada could emerge as an unexpected winner. With the trade war looming, one thing is clear: global trade will never be the same again. But will the United States adjust to this new reality, or will it fight to maintain its control? The answer will determine the future of the transatlantic economy. A new economic alliance? Canada has already established a solid foundation with the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, a trade pact with the European Union that eliminates tariffs on 98% of goods and services. This agreement allows Canadian businesses to access European markets with fewer restrictions, making it an attractive alternative for European nations seeking to diversify their supply chains. Meanwhile, the United States continues to struggle with ongoing trade disputes, tariffs, and unpredictable economic policies, which have made European leaders increasingly wary of relying too heavily on American imports. Beyond Europe, Canada is also expanding its trade footprint in other regions. Latin America has emerged as a key partner, with Canada strengthening ties through agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. This allows Canada to trade more freely with nations like Mexico, Chile, and Peru, further reducing its dependence on the United States. Additionally, Canada has been actively negotiating energy and technology partnerships in Asia, particularly with Japan and South Korea, two of the world's largest importers of natural resources and advanced technology. If these trade agreements continue to gain traction, Canada could solidify itself as a major global trading hub. This would not only weaken the economic influence of the United States, but also provide European and Asian markets with a more politically stable alternative. The question now is whether these nations will fully commit to shifting away from American imports in favor of a new Canada-centric economic alliance. As Canada's trade network continues to grow, the effects will ripple through NATO, forcing its member states to reconsider their long-standing economic ties with the United States. Will NATO shift away from U.S. economic control? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has long been seen as both a military and economic alliance, with the United States serving as its dominant force. However, the economic landscape of NATO is undergoing a transformation. Canada's latest trade push in Europe is raising questions about whether NATO allies will start looking beyond the United States for economic leadership. Historically, the United States has used its economic power as leverage within NATO, ensuring that its allies remained dependent on American industries for energy, technology, and defense-related goods. However, the past decade has seen growing frustration among European leaders regarding Washington's economic policies. Tariffs on European steel and aluminum, energy disputes, and restrictions on key technology exports have led many NATO members to reconsider their dependence on American supply chains. Canada's growing presence in European markets presents an attractive alternative. Unlike the United States, Canada offers a stable political environment, fewer trade restrictions, and a more predictable economic strategy. European nations like Germany and France have already signaled interest in expanding trade with Canada, particularly in energy and aerospace sectors. If these nations begin shifting even a fraction of their military and industrial supply chains toward Canada, it could weaken Washington's influence over NATO's economic direction. Additionally, Canada's emergence as a major energy supplier is causing further shifts within NATO. As Europe seeks to reduce its reliance on Russian gas, Canada has stepped in as a viable alternative, exporting liquefied natural gas and other energy resources to European nations. If this trend continues, NATO's economic dependence on the United States will continue to erode. While NATO remains a US-led alliance militarily, the economic dynamics are shifting. If Canada and other NATO members develop stronger trade ties independent of Washington, the alliance could see a long-term rebalancing of economic power. The result would be a NATO that is no longer economically dictated by the United States, but rather one that is more diversified and multipolar in its trade relationships. So, is this the end of US dominance in global trade? Or is it just the beginning of a new era where multiple nations share economic power? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.